In this episode of Colorado Experience, we'll hear the story of a mysterious Frenchman who was a master of second chances. Hi, I'm John Ferrugia. Louie Dupuis was a seminary dropout turned newspaper reporter who became the proprietor of one of the finest establishments in Colorado. He opened the Hotel Depuy amidst a mining boom that nearly killed him, and he left a legacy in Georgetown that today lets you step back in time to the days when silver kings and queens reigned in Colorado. And now, Colorado Experience. Hotel Dupuis.
The Hotel Depuy was a destination. It was designed to catch your breath.
We had this little bit of France in the middle of the Rocky Mountains.
It was the best of the best. The West has always been a place where you would either try to lose yourself or find yourself. Louie Dupuis walks a fine line when it comes to telling who he is and who he wants you to think he is.
He was very mysterious, and everybody likes a good mystery.
This program was funded by the History Colorado State Historical Fund,
supporting projects throughout the state to preserve, protect, and interpret Colorado's architectural and archaeological treasures. History Colorado State Historical Fund. Create the future, honor the past.
with support from the Denver Public Library, History Colorado, with additional funding and support from these fine organizations. And viewers like you. Thank you.
Gold was discovered in the Rocky Mountains in 1859, and once word got out, pioneers packed up their belongings and hit the trail, making their way west with their eyes on the prize. Mining towns such as Bonanza, Creede, and Georgetown popped up across the state of Colorado and soon became booming, bustling hubs of activity. As Georgetown's population grew, the need for refinement became apparent, and a mysterious Frenchman created a sanctuary for weary prospectors, traveling salesmen, and intellectuals in the heart of the Wild West. 30 years earlier, Adolphe François Girard was born to two innkeepers in Alençon, France, and here begins our story.
Adolphe François Girard is raised by his stepfather and his mother, who at the age of 15 send him away to a nearby seminary run by the Catholic Church. At the age of 19, he was in a mass and he was given the communion wafer. He chews it and decides to spit it out onto the floor of the church.
Girard dropped out of seminary or perhaps was expelled.
He then goes to Paris, France, and he gets a job as a dishwasher in a hotel. When he turns 22, he decides that he will come to the United States. He sails across the Atlantic.
And moved to New York City to become a translator and a newspaper reporter, but that fell apart. And so he joined the Army.
He's first sent out to Fort Riley, Kansas, and then further on into the Wyoming Territory to Cheyenne.
And allegedly deserted from the Army.
This is when he takes on the name Louie Dupuis, the name of a French philosopher.
With a new name and another new career, writing for the Rocky Mountain News, Louie Dupuis set off for the mountains. Like many Colorado adventurers before and after, he cast his troubled past aside, building up a new identity with each new step and each word he wrote for the newspaper, until one day, Dupuis came across the greatest silver camp in Colorado.
The West has always been a place where you would either try to lose yourself or find yourself.
Ultimately, Dupuis became a wage-earning miner, made his living deep underground, wrestling silver from the rock and from the mountain.
He and his partner were working in the mine. 2 shots of dynamite are set, 1 fires and 1 does not. Louie realizes that the shot is about to fire, so he shouts out a warning. The shot fires and he's seriously injured, in fact, nearly killed.
According to the Colorado miner, Louie's accident left him mangled in a most cruel manner, and after 2.5 years of self-reflection and recuperation under the loving care of Georgetown's nuns, Louie was eager to take advantage of his second chance at life.
The public raised money so that he could acquire the Delmonico bakery.
And he decided that he would build a little souvenir of his home in Alençon, France, in the Rocky Mountains.
In 1875, when Louis Dupuis opens Hotel de Paris, the population of Georgetown was 3,500 people. It would eventually climb to 5,000, and local boosters had their eye on being the state capital.
Imagine, if you will, coming to Georgetown before the railroad arrives on a stagecoach over these back-breaking Rocky Mountain trails. You arrive in Georgetown, dust yourself off, and right away you are in the height of elegance and luxury.
It would be like a fantasy land.
The hotel is designed as a French country inn.
Dupuis started with one simple building, but as time went on, he added on to the hotel.
An addition is put off the back, that is the commercial kitchen. In 1882, there was a west wing. In 1889, an east wing.
And added them into one big monumental building.
What he ended up with was a facade that looked like 3 different buildings, and he hated it. And so he put stucco over the whole thing, has it scored to look like blocks of stone, adds a marquee at the top that says Hotel de Paris, and then his own name over the dining room door. So you know who the proprietor is.
And that's just the outside. Once you come inside, there's a large, sumptuous dining room.
One of the primary features of the dining room is the striped floor. It is made of silver maple and black walnut.
And it was very much like a country inn in France, where there would be a few rooms to rent if people had come from long ways.
He is charging $4 a night, which is an outrageous figure for our town.
In the early hotels, you rented a bed. You might not have that bed to yourself. You very often slept with someone else.
So it was basically your pillow rate.
This place was way ahead of its time. A boiler, steam heat, running water, absolutely amazing.
Hotel de Paris had flushing toilets by 1889.
Every room had a sink with faucets, and they had hot and cold running water. We had gas light until we got electricity in 1893.
You're supposed to be in a rough and rugged mining camp, and suddenly you find yourself in what would be a respectable hotel in Paris.
What distinguished the Hotel de Paris was its restaurant.
The focus was on the restaurant and on his wonderful French cooking.
Louie was often standing at the door, greeting people and bringing them into the dining room or giving them a room for the night. He would be dressed in a tuxedo, greeting people at the door. And then he would disappear in the kitchen, and he would put on an apron and a chef's hat, and he would come back and he said, "Now you will meet your chef."
You could order something as simple as cold cuts and a beer, or something as extravagant as raw oysters, pheasant, and champagne.
A lot of wild game meat, buffalo and elk and venison.
Rocky Mountain trout. He had a fountain in the dining room, and he would pluck the trout out, and you could select your own trout, and then he would fix it for you for dinner.
They would have a crisp white linen tablecloth under French imported Havilland china from Limoges, France.
The wine that Louis served had to be a big deal, especially in our small town.
They would be drinking French champagne. They would be drinking California clarets. They would have whiskey, port wine, and beer available. Louis was also famous for his coffee, tea, and hot chocolate, but in particular, he was known for his fine wine cellar.
One of the things that Louis Dupuis offered was oysters on the half shell. And I think we all know that that is a tricky business.
Oysters, raw oysters, fried oysters, canned oysters, fresh oysters. How did they get oysters into the Rocky Mountains?
Oysters were very popular all over America, and so when people came west, they expected oysters.
And for somebody like Dupuis to have oysters on the menu was a sign of how civilized you were.
After 1877, when the train connects us to the marketplace, we're able to get oysters from the Gulf,
which they would pack with ice and salt.
And people were hired on the train to throw cornmeal into the barrels of oysters so that they would be kept alive all the way to our mountain town.
And it must have been something if you were from the East Coast to come into a hotel in the Rocky Mountains and find fresh oysters on the menu.
Hotel de Paris was a site where a lot of traveling salesmen would come through. Louis Dupuis was smart about driving business through this hotel, so he built 3 salesman showrooms or sample rooms,
where salesmen could come and set up their wares and actually sell their goods out of the hotel.
You could have women's hats, statuary, tools.
And there was a manufacturer of soaps and one of writing instruments, pens and things like that, mining supplies.
Fabrics, threads, of course, silverware.
And one of the more interesting one was a representative of the Heinz Pickle Company.
The salesmen were also a source of news, so people would rely on the salesmen to find out sort of what was going on in the world.
If you went on the tour of what boosters called the Switzerland of America, you would inevitably find your way to Georgetown and to the Hotel de Paris.
Everybody wanted to see Colorado.
There were some guests from England, Ireland, Scotland. There were Scandinavian countries, Russia, some far-flung places like Constantinople, Australia.
Railroad men, people like Jay Gould, the railroad titan of the 19th century, the man who collected railroads like other people collected baseball trading cards. Opera singers, vaudevillians, dancers, performers would all come to the Hotel de Paris as well.
And there were a lot of investors who came and people who wanted to see the West, a lot of writers and newspaper men.
William Henry Jackson was hired by the federal government to go into the West and take pictures of the developing and the untouched West. Jackson was a guest here.
Lena Stoiber, she was a mining engineer. She was married to Edward Stoiber, and they actually visited the hotel on their honeymoon on their way to Silverton, where they made their home.
Isabella Byrd, an English traveler who traveled through Colorado in the 1870s, came up to Georgetown as a tourist, and she stayed at the Hotel de Paris. And she said that Georgetown was the only community in the Rocky Mountains that she could actually label with the term picturesque.
Dr. James Russell came to Hotel de Paris. He visited quite a bit with Louis Dupuis, and he found Louis to be a bit irascible. But they grew on each other.
And they discussed the art of healthy eating. Dr. Russell felt that Louis had some really good ideas about health.
He ate healthy, and he went to the gym almost daily. He liked the punching bag in particular. As part of Louis Dupuis' health regimen, he took an ice-cold bath daily.
He brought that idea from France, where he thought that was a very good way to stimulate the body.
Dr. James Russell developed a course on domestic science at Columbia University, based in his visit at Hotel de Paris, and it became home economics as we know it today.
In the boom times, Louis put on a big dinner in the dining room. He invited a lot of very prominent people like Mr. Loveland, Mr. Berthoud, and he has a wonderful speech. He wanted to be remembered for this little souvenir of his hometown in Alençon. The housekeeper, Sophie Galley, was kind of a mysterious person in her own right.
She was a friend, a confidant, and trusted employee.
She had her own private room upstairs, right at the head of the stairs.
She took care of guests, she took care of the rooms.
And she liked to sit in front of the hotel in the sun.
And she was, in her way, kind of mysterious, but like Dupuis, very beloved in the community.
Louis Dupuis had some other help running his hotel. There was quite a few Chinese people that came with the railroad.
We know from the 1885 Colorado census that one of the employees at Hotel de Paris was a Chinese man we know as John Tuke. He was working as a gardener at Hotel de Paris, growing leafy greens like chard and spinach for the restaurant, also herbs. He grew flowers such as roses and sunflowers for the dining room tables and for the rooms if a lady stayed here. During the winter, which is quite long in Georgetown, he would have been helping with just basic duties like chopping wood for the stoves in the kitchen, stoking the boiler with the coal, plucking chickens, and helping to cook. Unlike the other Chinese men living in Georgetown, John had a roof over his head, food in his belly, and money in his pocket. Louis Dupuis was known as the mysterious Frenchman.
And everybody likes a good mystery.
He had a little mustache, he had a fairly decent head of hair. Of course, everybody that had any wealth at all always appeared properly clothed in a suit and tie and vest, and never went out without a hat.
The newspaper was obviously full of stories about Louie Dupuis. The McClellan Opera House burned down in 1892, which was one building over. As the fire laddies, as they were called, the firehouse boys, were putting out the fire of the McClellan house, Louie Dupuis was standing at the door of the hotel holding a shotgun. And he was saying, if any of the fire laddies come into my hotel to take out my furniture, I will shoot them. And then after this was over and the fire was gone, he invited all of the firemen back into the hotel for free drinks.
Dupuis was extremely well-read, the best French philosophers and political thinkers, and he read them all.
He had over 2,500 books on the property, both in French and English, and they are well marked and read.
At one time considered the finest library in the state of Colorado.
One of the things that he liked to do was to sit in his study with special guests and have brandy and cigars after dinner and discuss the world situation.
Getting this invitation into his inner sanctum was an education in philosophy and politics and radical political thought in a way that was almost unique in the Rocky Mountains.
Louie Dupuis was known as a lone wolf and also as a playboy about town.
He was in love with a local woman who did not return his affections.
He proposed once to a young lady we know as Ida Bryant. Ida said no because she was significantly younger than Louie.
And she married someone else. Some years ago, someone removed a mirror in Louie's quarters, and behind the mirror was a piece of paper on which he had written a fantasy about this young woman. My mother-in-law was asked to translate this, which was written in French. I asked her what was in it, and she said, I believe I'll let Louie keep that secret.
The belief is he was so heartbroken, he never proposed marriage again. So instead of having one young, pretty wife, he decides that he'll have many girlfriends. So he was known to date young women, married ladies, and he was also a big customer of the brothels.
The newspaper often gave Louie a bad reputation, saying that he did not care for women in his property. However, the registers show that many women stayed here.
He welcomed ladies who came as tourists, and they were welcome to stay here at the hotel. There's no doubt about it.
In fact, when a woman stayed in the hotel, Louie would put fresh flowers in the room to let her know she was welcome.
We know that he loved women and had many girlfriends over the years. We know that he proposed marriage and that he desired a family. He still is known as a misogynist, but we who study him feel that that is untrue.
Louie lived life to the fullest, and he also died with a certain flair. He was used to taking ice-cold baths, and he caught pneumonia.
When he was recovering from pneumonia,
The doctor said, for goodness sake, Louie, do not take an ice bath. And of course, he didn't listen to that and took an ice bath.
When the end was near, he called for 2 bottles of his finest champagne,
Sophie, bring me cold champagne.
and he drank them, and he died.
That was the end of Louie.
As Dupuis faded, so did the prospects of a community like Georgetown. The Leadville strike of 1880 was really the beginning of the end for Georgetown.
When Louis passed, he left his hotel, his ranch, all of his belongings to his dear friend Sophie Galli. Though Louis referred to Aunt Sophie as a guest, in reality she was his closest friend, his only family.
Overnight, Sophie goes from housekeeper to proprietor.
Now, she did not know English. She was totally alone.
She did not have the skills to sign a guest into the guest register, calculate a bill and make change, or even sign for a delivery.
I can imagine her fear and her anxiety that her one mentor and her one relative and friend in America had passed away.
Sophie tragically only lived a few months after Dupuis.
When she dies, she is buried with Louis, and on their grave marker is a motif that is a bird's nest with 2 little birds, and it reads "de bon ami," which translates from French as 2 good friends.
All of a sudden, Georgetown is faced with finding relatives of Sophie Galli.
So fairly quick, Hotel de Paris was leased in 1901 to a local family known as the Burkholders, James Burkholder and his wife Sarah Harrison Burkholder.
The repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act in 1893 led to a drop in silver's value and a corresponding dip in visitors to Georgetown. Overnight, the once booming Silver City saw its population cut in half.
The Burkholders continued to operate the hotel, first as a fairly fine hotel.
They kept on with the French cuisine and the French flair. I think the idea was to maintain the clientele that Louie Dupuis had built. But then when the private automobile comes to the mountains, Americans just want to get to their destination. Georgetown is no longer the destination, it becomes a pass-through town.
The Burkholders adjust to the changing circumstances of Georgetown. So it continued to operate, but I would say nowhere at the level of class or financial success that it had when Dupuis had been in charge during the glory days of Georgetown.
During the 1940s, the hotel morphed into a boarding house in an effort to keep the business alive. But by 1949, the writing was on the beautifully wallpapered walls, and it was time for the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America in the state of Colorado to step in.
The Colonial Dames began operating the Hotel Depuy in 1954, and they converted it into a museum to talk about the glory days of Georgetown and of silver mining.
I think it was one of the first times Georgetown realized that it was a historic community and it could draw history lovers here through heritage tourism.
The Dames had opened it all summer long, every year from 1954.
Costumes were provided for long skirts, brown, with overlay aprons, long sleeves, a lace collar, and a little chapeau hat. We served coffee and croissant. We had a French baker that came just on weekends.
They restored the rooms back to their look and appearance in the 1870s and 1880s, when this was part of Louie Dupuis' hotel.
And there was a lot of restoration to do. My mother got involved. One of her big jobs was to repair certain parts of the hotel which were in danger. So the restoration preservation started in the early 1970s.
So they kept this place from falling down. They made sure that the roof was good and that repairs took place and that they kept up with the maintenance of the building so that the harsh winters in Georgetown wouldn't pull this building apart.
One of the great things about the hotel is that it simply closed its doors. When the Colonial Dames acquired it, the furniture was here, the decor was here, the kitchen was here. And so this is the real thing.
We've tried valiantly to keep the look of the 19th century alive because it was an important part of our history. Without the silver and gold, where would we be?
French Louis was a pioneer, one who brought sophistication to a booming mining town at a time when whiskey cured colds and a hot bath was hard to find. Preserved today as a museum and a site of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Hotel de Paris remains a treasure in Georgetown's historic district and continues to tell the tale of the mysterious Frenchman.
This was the place to see and be seen in Georgetown. And the fact that as a 21st century visitor, you can drive up to Georgetown, you can come into the Hotel de Paris, and you can see the old world elegance that Louie Dupuis wanted his visitors to experience. It's kind of a form of vicarious time travel.
The hotel gave the town a feeling of gentility, of elegance. It made it a little more sophisticated than some of the neighboring towns.
It tells a story of the West and of our country and how different parts of it came to be and were successful.
Louie Dupuis and Sophie Galley created a sense of respectability, of refinement, of luxury and civilization, which set Georgetown apart from any other mining community. Georgetown wouldn't be Georgetown today without the Hotel de Paris. This is an artifact and a relic of Georgetown in its silver mining heyday. This was a place where millions of dollars were produced every year, literally wrestled out of the ground. But it was also a place to pursue an intellectual life. Louie Dupuis had worked as a miner, he had worked as a journalist, but he also understood that people did that work so that they could live a rich life.
The main lesson you can learn from Louie Dupuis is that you can do anything if you work hard enough at it, that your dreams can be realized if you have the fortitude and the knowledge and the interest and the love.
His story is really one of human foibles. The legacy of Louie Dupuis would be the ability to change direction in life. I think his is a story of second chances.
This building is really his monument.
Hotel de Paris is considered the most complete historic parcel in the state of Colorado. And with that comes a lot of responsibility.
And I think to have a standing hotel that is a little piece of history, looking just as it was in 1900, is going to be an outstanding legacy for the future, for people to see and realize that this was an important time in our country.
People in the West are inclined to fabricate history because it's glamorous, but we didn't need to here.
It is the real thing.
It was a very proud era for Georgetown, Colorado. We need to keep that heritage.
And by preserving the Hotel de Paris, we remember that richness, and we remember why it is we struggle through our own lives today.